All right, so the reason we're all here today is to talk about living shorelines in Connecticut. Now, this isn't actually a new idea. Back in 1969, Ian McHarg wrote a seminal book called Design with Nature. Ian had grown up outside of Glasgow, which he described as a monumental testament to the capacity to develop ugliness. He went on after that, but it got considerably less flattering, and so I won't repeat what he said. But for those of you who know Glasgow, Scotland, it's surrounded by the Scottish countryside, which is spectacularly beautiful, particularly when it's not raining. And he was perturbed by Glasgow and its incredible ugliness and thought there had to be another way. So following World War II, he went to Harvard, where he majored in landscape architecture and city planning. And he came back to Scotland, hoping to use all these new and wonderful ideas of beauty in city development, only to find that in post-World War II Scotland, they had a housing boom, and Glasgow had expanded into his beloved countryside. And instead of designing with nature, they had pretty much paved everything and made block after block of identical tenement flats. So he opens his book, Design with Nature, with a study comparing the Dutch coastline with the New Jersey coastline. And so what he says that the Dutch, in their long history of preventing coastal erosion and holding back the sea, they had learned that they could not stop the sea. It was going to go somewhere. So the best bet was to design with nature. So if you've been on the Dutch shoreline, they actively encourage their dunes. They're vegetated. You do not build in front of them. You do not build on them. You do not walk on them, except for naturalists. Then there's a space between the dune and their dikes, which are man-made and are hardened, but still flexible structures. And in this way, they kind of mimic nature's own protection to the destructive forces of the sea. And he was comparing this with the New Jersey shoreline and their love of concrete and their lack of love of dune or vegetation. And so he remarks in his opening of Design with Nature that what is commonly known to even school children in the Netherlands is not even discussed in academia, much less found its way into coastal engineering manuals and building guides. But not much later, in 1977, Paul Knudsen, who was with the Coastal Engineering Research Center of the Army Corps of Engineers, wrote two guides, two planting guides. One was on marsh development and the other was on dune development and restoration. And so in about 10 years, we now have the Army Corps of Engineers realizing the importance of vegetation. And not much later, in '81, they developed a series of low-cost shore protection. There's one for engineers and contractors. There's one for homeowners. And in it, they describe planting and even give planting guides. And now, the Shore Protection Manual, which was the Bible of coastal engineering, has been replaced by the Coastal Engineering Manual. And there is actually an entire chapter on environmental restoration, of which planting is a significant portion. There is not a significant discussion on designing, planting, and living shorelines as shore protection. But if this is not a new idea, why do we have what seems as sudden interest in this area? Well, the reason is Irene and Sandy. After Tropical Storm Irene and Superstorm Sandy, the Connecticut legislation formed a task force on climate adaptation and shoreline preservation. And the outcome of this task force was to develop a series of recommendations which went forward to the General Assembly, which then passed Public Act 12-101, which you can read as well as I can. Anyway, the point of this Public Act was a couple of things, but one of it was to define more clearly what we were trying to do in terms of shoreline protection. And it was discouraging hardened structures, the more traditional seawalls, bulkheads, groins, breakwaters, in favor of using more environmentally friendly structures. And it describes them, and in fact it mentions a number which it calls out, but it's not limited to these. And this is the guideline that's set forward for engineers and towns to use when considering coastal protection projects. Now, as I said, living shorelines have been around for quite a while. This is a guide that was put out by VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Studies. And it makes it clear that, like traditional shoreline protection structures, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so it shows the shoreline broken up into different regions, very similar to what McHarg did in 1969. And so if we start off down at the far end, there are living breakwaters. This is in the water. And then there's submerged aquatic vegetation, and then the tidal marsh. And underneath, it gives us a series of different solutions that might work in these various regions. And later on this morning, Lauren Swarnoff is going to discuss these different types in more detail. So I'm not going to go into great detail about them now. But here are some pictures of some different types. There's plantings of oysters. Down in the far corners, we've got core fiber. One is to protect a marsh area that's being developed. One is actually behind the marsh area, but is protecting the backshore area. Here's a low sill, they call it. It's like a mini breakwater. And down here, we have a hybrid solution. And this is what I think we're going to find we're going to have to use more in Connecticut, where you have a bulkhead, and behind it you have vegetation. Now, with all of this designs that have been in place, the difficulty is they've been predominantly employed in regions like the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries and the Gulf of Mexico. But what's most important is the old real estate adage, location, location, location. What designs are going to be successful in a certain place is going to depend on the geography, the geology, and the coastal processes. Now, if you look at the Atlantic shoreline, you can see that the Chesapeake Bay runs north-south, while Long Island Sound runs east-west. Well, this becomes very important when we're considering hurricanes, which typically travel up the coast. They have a much different impact on the Long Island Sound than they do on the Chesapeake Bay. Additionally, up here, we are frequently hit by nor'easters, which, unlike fast-moving hurricanes, move very slowly, usually over several tidal ranges, which means the surge that comes in does not come out. And this is what happened during Sandy. It happened over several tidal ranges, and so the tide never went out. It just kept coming in, flooding our marshes. Geology is important. Many shore protection designs are to trap sediment. But if there's no sediment available to be trapped, they're not going to be successful. And lastly, and my favorite, is coastal processes. So unlike the Chesapeake Bay and the Louisiana coast and Alabama, Connecticut has a very variable shoreline, even very close to each other. There's a highly variable shoreline. I was just talking to Verusian this morning about if we walked around here, how many different types of shorelines we would see, and how many different types of protection. There's groins, there's revetment, there's sandy beaches, there's rocky outcropping, just here. So here's a few. We've got an eroding bluff here, a rocky bluff here. This is, if you look out the window, you can see this. This is at Bluff Point. We've got marshes. We've got another eroding bluff. And we have sand, and we have cobbles, all of which are going to necessitate a different design to be successful. In coastal processes and in geography, the tidal range is important. The tidal range in Chesapeake Bay ranges from about a half a foot to not quite a foot and a half. This is the tidal range just in Long Island Sound. We start down in Noank, best place ever, and it's only a couple feet. But as we move farther west, we're up to a mean tidal range of 7 feet. So those little berms or sills that work well in the Chesapeake Bay are not going to be successful in a 7-foot tidal range. In the Chesapeake Bay, they're concerned about boat wakes. A lot of their coastal erosion are caused by boat wakes. Up here, we're concerned about wind waves. Now, wind waves are developed when wind blows over water. But you need, funny that, isn't it? But to get wind waves, you need a fetch, and that's the distance the wind has to blow over water to develop the waves. So waves are either depth limited or fetch limited. Now depth limited is pretty easy. If you have 3 inches of water, you're not going to have a 20-foot wave. Fetch limited means that the waves can only develop to a certain height, no matter how long the wind blows, because it only has a certain distance to blow over. The tidal range is important. The nearshore bathymetry. Do we have a gradual shoreline? Do we have a sandy shoreline? Do we have a rocky shoreline? Do we have a steep shoreline? And if you think of many of the places here, the high tide line is right against a shore protection structure. What that means is we can have bigger waves right against the shoreline that we're trying to protect. And lastly, we have sediment transport. Whether we have any sediment available to transport is one thing, but whether we are looking at a sandy beach or a rocky shoreline, all make a difference. And now, Varuzhan Hajapian from GEI Consultants is going to talk much more in depth about coastal processes.